Hey guys, I'm going to give you a recap on what we've talked about this week. You're going to have to be patient with me. I'm doing it after school, and there are lots of announcements for checkout. So if we get interrupted, I'll just pause for a second and I'll go right on. So you should have week 7 newspaper. It is called Jamestown and the Challenges and Successes. So make sure you have that newspaper. All this highlighted material is extremely important. So make sure that you have that in front of you as you take your quiz. We talked about the colonists coming to the Americas. We've talked about Roanoke, we've talked about Plymouth, and now we're ready to talk about Jamestown in detail. We do know that they came to Jamestown, and the relationship with the Indians was not quite like the one that they had at Plymouth. At Plymouth, remember, we talked about Thanksgiving and how they ate together, and the Indians helped show the colonists how to grow crops and to fish and to hunt. But here in Jamestown, they kind of came in a little bit differently than the Pilgrims did. They were wanting land and money and stuff, and they didn't want, or materials for money, but they didn't necessarily have a need to get along with the Indians. The Indians didn't believe that you could own land, that they thought the land belonged to everybody and anybody could use it, and the colonists came in and they built fences.
Kate Huffman and Jesse Williams come to the office for checkout. Kate Huffman and Jesse Williams.
All right, but they built fences around their land, and they were like, hey, keep out, this is my area. You can't come in, that kind of thing. And this was the Indians' land for thousands of years. They were really confused by this. But as the colonists began to settle the land and move around and stuff, they were slowly pushing the Indians further and further inland. And when supplies ran out and they needed to get supplies, they decided to trade or barter with the Indians, which was a good relationship at first. But once the supplies ran low and that kind of stuff, they just started taking things from the Indians, stealing it. And then they would enslave Indians and make them work the land and stuff. So the relationship between the Indians and the colonists in Jamestown was not a good thing. As the tobacco fields began to grow bigger and bigger, there was need for more work. And we're going to talk about bringing African men, women, and children in to work the lands. But that's basically a rundown of what we talked about. So I'm going to go into a little more detail a little bit. Remember, I said the relationship with the Indians and the colonists were not great. And even sometimes like hostile, like the Indians would attack the colonists because they felt like they were taking their land, which they were, and the colonists like burned Indian villages and stole their food and forced them to work labor and stuff like that. So just keep that in mind as we go through this newspaper, that relationship is not a good one. So they came to Jamestown, and we said that it was a little different from Plymouth because they didn't have any women that came with them along the ship on the first time. It was just men, and perhaps that was because they thought the women wouldn't survive the harsh winters or whatever. I don't know. But anyways, the women didn't get to come at first, and so it was just the men. And once they got settled in, then they brought over women. We talked about 2 women that got to come early in the first year, Margaret Fox and Ann Burris. Ann Burris and John Layden were married, had a daughter, Virginia. She's the first baby born in Jamestown. And then I get lost on where I am. But anyways, so then they decided to give land to the men so that they could grow tobacco. And once they started getting stable and growing crops, they brought over 90 unmarried women on a ship to Jamestown in 1620. And if a man wanted to get married, he had to give the Virginia Company 150 pounds of tobacco in order to pay for his wife's journey over to America. So then they got married, had families, and Jamestown began to flourish and become a permanent settlement, which means forever, whatever. And Jamestown is still there today. So that was true. But as the tobacco fields got bigger, they needed more work. So they brought in 1619, they brought in 20 African Americans on the White Lion. They first came in as indentured servants, where they would work to pay off their trip to America for 5 to 7 years. At the end of that time, they would be free, and then they could either go their own way or they could work for pay, whatever. And that worked out really well for them for the first few years. But as tobacco got more and more popular, they needed more and more workers, and the Africans that they brought over in the 1620s that were working as indentured servants by the 1660s were actually no longer to earn their freedom. They just were enslaved for life. So we talked a little bit about the Jamestown economy. We talked about some things that they tried to do other than tobacco. They sent glass blowers over because they thought they had sand and wood that would make good glass. And there was a couple of pieces of glass they were able to send back, but nothing profitable, so they closed that company down. And then they decided that they wanted the colonists to grow flax. Which is a material used, or it's a plant used to make linen, which is a durable, waterproof material or quick drying material. And flax didn't grow well because this land wasn't very fertile. This land was actually not really good for much of anything. It just wasn't good soil, and I'm shocked that Jamestown lasted as a permanent settlement because the soil wasn't good. They had disease carrying mosquitoes and stuff like that, and plus with all the Indian attacks and things like that, I was just shocked. But it happened, and Jamestown is still there today. But anyways, so they couldn't grow they could not grow, the flax, and so they tried silkworms after that. And that didn't work, so they finally ended up growing tobacco. It worked, and it became a very profitable cash crop. And if you remember from previous lessons, we have John Ralph to thank for bringing tobacco to this area. Tobacco is how it's grown. We talked about that earlier. You put it in a pot, and then as you put the seeds in the pot, as the plant grows, you pull the plant out of the pot and you put it in a mound, and so it doesn't grow underground. But experienced workers could work 500 mounds a day, and that's pretty impressive. When they would go to pick off the tobacco leaves, they could only leave 4 or 5 leaves on each plant, and if not, then they would get destroyed by like hornworms and stuff like that, so they couldn't leave very many leaves on there. But they would pull these plants off and they'd hang them up to dry them out and everything, and then they would put them into barrels called hogsheads and send them back over to England to the Virginia Company. There were several plantations of tobacco fields and a lot of workers, and most of them were enslaved. The last thing we talked about was the ownership. They didn't like to be owned, not the people, but the land. They didn't like to work the land that was owned by England. They wanted stuff for themselves. And you can imagine if they were working really hard in the fields and stuff and not getting any pay for it, it could be very frustrating. And they did get frustrated. They were like, why are we doing all this work if we're just giving everything to them? Nothing's helping us. And so they just quit. They quit working. And then when Sir Thomas Dale came over, he was going to be the governor of Jamestown. He came over and he saw that people weren't working and they weren't doing anything for the Virginia Company, and he realized he needed to do something. So when he talked to the people, they were like, we're not working all this hard work and doing all this for people that aren't doing anything for us, that aren't, we're not working just for them and all that kind of stuff. So they decided he decided to start an ownership program where he could give them 3 acres of land, and whatever they chose to do with that land, they could keep, or if they grow tobacco or crops or whatever, they could keep all that as profit, but they still had to work the other land for the Virginia Company. And so they agreed to that, and it worked out really well. And they quickly learned that the harder they worked, the richer they got, and that's what's going to cause Jamestown to flourish. So I hope you paid attention enough to do well on this quiz. So make sure you take the quiz, and I will see you tomorrow. Have a good day. Bye.